Welcome to our continuing series of Virtual Voices, focusing on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our speaker today is Mr. Jonathan Granoff, who is the president of Goodall Security Institute, a permanent observer for the International Anti-Corruption Academy to the United Nations, who is an attorney, an author, and an international advocate, emphasizing the legal and ethical dimensions of human development and security. His special focus is on advancing the rule of law, international security, anti-corruption, and the threats posed by nuclear weapons. He served on numerous governing and advisory boards, including the Nonpartisan Security Group, Voice for Free World of Nuclear Weapons of the United Religious Initiative, Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, Jane Goodall Institute, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Disarmament, and he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014. Over to you, Mr. Granoff.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Well, I want to take the lens of today's crisis du jour and go back a few hundred years and talk about how we got here and what we might do to get out of the crisis that we're in. I want to go back to the 17th century. 17th century saw Europe in a bloodbath. Protestants and Catholics were slaughtering each other in massive numbers. Parts of Central Europe had a third of the population decimated. In the 1640s, a bunch of wonks got together. I don't know if they were wonks or nerds, I'm not quite sure of the contemporary vocabulary, but scholarly, thoughtful, legally minded, institutionally sophisticated people came together in Westphalia and figured out a way to separate the warring factions, who were, by the way, fighting over whose definition of the love of Jesus was better. How ironic. And thus the modern state was created. In a sense, it's a horse and buggy road from another time. And war continued in Europe. World War I, World War II, massive destruction. And out of the ashes of these catastrophes, out of the ashes of nations, almost with the same vigor and passion of religions, slaughtering massive numbers of people, increasingly civilians, as today it's civilians are the largest victims of the institution of war, the United Nations system was created. We, the peoples of the world, through our nations, to prevent the scourge of war. But now, today, we're facing a war, again in Europe. And we're facing another war that, in a sense, begins around the same time, which is the technological and scientific foundation of the Industrial Revolution, also takes place in the 17th century. And if somebody just a few hundred years ago had said, we will organize ourselves to actually melt the polar ice cap, change the pH of the oceans, and put the third lung of humanity, the phytoplankton, at risk. We will burn down our other, since the oceans provide 60 to 70% of our oxygen through phytoplankton, we will put our very survival, the survival of humanity, at risk. We'll make humans an endangered species by our technical prowess. And we'll cut down the other part of our lungs, the rainforests, faster than they can replenish. And we'll organize ourselves in such a way that we'll privilege industries that are capable of doing this. Any sane person at that time would have said, this is not within human capacity. They would have said, it's not possible for human beings to do this. But we now know that we are doing this, and we're doing it at an increasingly rapid rate to the hazard of all of us. And as the Secretary General recently said, we're at war with nature, and we're at war amongst nations. So we're in a very critical moment in history that stretches back to inventions, ideas, and institutions created literally centuries ago. We have another vision. The nations of the world, largely because of the vision that took place in the 1990s at a series of world summits in which the tremendous value of hope and vision enlivened diplomats at the World Summit on Gender in Beijing, the World Summit on the rights of children, the World Summit on the environment, the World Summit on habitat, on our cities, the World Summit on poverty, out of which emerged the Millennium Development Goals, at which the nations of the world agreed to address coherently and in an integrated fashion poverty, the environment, gender equity, education, water, which then emerged as the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 integrated goals, in a sense, an integrated human security agenda, addressing issues that no nation or group of nations are capable of addressing. The climate doesn't recognize borders. And at the same time, as we're facing this human security vision, we are in a war in Europe, a war in which one of the parties is incoherently agreeing in the G20 meeting recently in Indonesia to state that nuclear weapons are inadmissible, and at the same time regularly threatening international order with the use of them. And the other major party in this war, the United States, has a president who campaigned on a platform that the only value of nuclear weapons is to prevent them from being used, essentially a no first use platform. But that's not the actual policy and deployments of NATO or the United States. We have a situation in which these devices, which could end the very future of humanity, are negotiated in good faith, seriously, by diplomats, every 5 years at a review conference of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which has every nation in the world except for 4, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and Israel. Every other nation in the world is a party, in which these nations have agreed that they would negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons. And they've agreed that they would obtain a ban on testing nuclear weapons, negotiate a fissile material cutoff treaty, negotiate strengthening international safeguards, and reference the web of treaties that make the world, or did make the world, a bit safer. The INF Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty. But where are we? The countries with over 95% of these devices, the United States and Russia, are modernizing and or simultaneously expanding their weaponry in this paradox in which the more we improve the weapon, the less security we obtain. To what end? If these weapons are used, it will throw so much soot into the stratosphere, the agricultural base of humanity will be so compromised that civilization as we know it will no longer exist. That's less than 2% of the over 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world. So we're in a very, very unique, critical moment in which a vision of cooperation, a vision that would bring us authentic human security articulated in the Sustainable Development Goals, is one route forward. And then there's another vision. The other vision is continuing to do the same thing that we've been doing and expecting a different result. the adversarial intrinsic nature of the focus on the military national focus of defining security based on the raw pursuit of power. That's what's before us at this moment of choice. That's what's before all of us and all of our institutions. In the midst of this, we know that in order to fulfill the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, in order to fund the transition out of fossil fuel to renewables, in order to address in a cooperative, sane way pandemics, in order to protect the oceans, in order to address the immoral, unnecessary, and destabilizing effects of poverty in the world, in order to ensure that the third of our population of the world that doesn't have adequate sanitation and water has the basic dignity of what water provides, not just the water of life, but the water of a quality of life. That this will take money, but there isn't any money right now available for it. There isn't any money available because of the scourge of the recent pandemic of COVID. There isn't any money because the peace dividend that we had expected at the end of the Cold War is long gone, and all the major nations of the world are gearing up for military competition and funding an actual war. What's at stake is not just the short-term fulfillment of these goals, but whether or not the system in which we are living in can change to address these existential threats that we face. We might get out of this crisis for the short term, but structurally, if the budgets remain focused on military nationalism, if our industries remain privileged to disregard the effects on the environment, we will remain at severe risk. This is a fact. Since 2000, the world's major nations have spent in excess of $32 trillion on military expenditures, and it's increasing dramatically. A mere pittance of that would long ago have solved many of the environmental and poverty problems that we face. But the highest cost of this distorted approach to security is the institutionalization of existential adversity. That's what we are seeing in Ukraine. Every day, we run the risk of escalation by mistake or madness, bringing us into a nuclear catastrophe. That looms before us. And at the same time, there are mothers in the world who have to decide which one of their children will have sufficient calories to live another day. This is an unacceptable situation morally and practically speaking. We're at a unique moment in human history in which the moral imperative to see the human family as one with a collective destiny, the moral insight of the wise since time immemorial, has all of a sudden become a practical necessity. And in a way, the Sustainable Development Goals embody that moral vision in which no one is left out, in which, as the ancient Upanishad said, the world is one family, in which the admonition of Jesus to love your neighbor as yourself highlights that neighborhood today is a moral location, not a physical location. Highlights what we know in today's world, where with the little devices we have in our hands, we can talk to anybody, anywhere, that we can get along with people anywhere, everywhere at the same time. We know we have that ability. It's the ought that we have to strive for, the ought that says all human beings are created equal and have a right to dignity, freedom from fear, freedom from want. So where is there money? Where is there money that the nations of the world might be able to obtain in order to fulfill the commitments of the Sustainable Development Goals. Let me quote a little bit from, well, I don't need to quote, this is self-evident to people. There have been a number of studies showing that illicit financial transactions, tax avoidance, tax evasion, straight up bribery, human trafficking, drug running, gun running, exploitation of conflicts with tremendous corruption in military hardware, not only corrupt the people involved, but dramatically undermine the stability of societies. Moreover, trillions, according to very serious reports, between $2 and $3 trillion a year is bled from the coffers of nations that and economies that could be used to address fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals. That could be used to address health, stability in communities, basic infrastructure, renewable energy, the change that we know is possible and needed. There is money available, but we need to focus on getting it. Kofi Annan said, "Corruption is an insidious plague that has a wide range of corrosive effects on societies. It undermines democracy and the rule of law, leads to violations of human rights, distorts markets, erodes the quality of life, and allows organized crime, terrorism, and other threats to human security to flourish. This evil phenomena is found in all countries, big and small, rich and poor, but it is in the developing world that its effects are most destructive. Corruption hurts the poor disproportionately by diverting funds intended for development, undermining a government's ability to provide basic services, feeding inequality and injustice, and discouraging foreign aid and investment. Corruption is a key element in economic underperformance and a major obstacle to poverty alleviation and development." The current Secretary General, Anthony Guterres, has said, "Corruption breeds disillusion with government and governance and is often at the root of political dysfunction and social disunity." Corruption is rampant in authoritarian regimes in which the moral agency of a few dominates the lives of everybody. It's much less in democracies where there's open and free debate, but most of the world now is uncertain as to the stability of our democracies. The Sustainable Development Goals have to be met, not only because of the moral imperative of dealing with poverty and injustice and gender equity and the very survival for people, but if they're not met, the military model will be the only other model on the table. And we can see how dysfunctional and dangerous that is. So I personally devoted at least 40 years of my life to addressing the threat of nuclear annihilation. But it is apparent to me that the diplomats negotiating the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty commitments did so in good faith. And yet when they went back to their capitals, the Roman adage of the 5th century, prepare for war, receive peace, prepare for peace, receive war, has led and is leading to arms racing and a neglect to fulfill promises that were made in good faith. Very dangerous when diplomats make promises that are not adhered to. And even those who would say we'll keep arms control and we can handle it, we can keep the weapons, argued we will have strategic stability. but you can't have strategic stability with arms racing. Those are incompatible processes. So the entire realm of arms control, nonproliferation and disarmament is at risk. So we need to have another direction. And the other direction that I see is fulfilling the commitments of the Sustainable Development Goals. They are realistic, they are practical, but they need money. So I'm very, very committed to addressing the value of capacity building and commitment to address corruption in its many forms. The corruption that steals the assets needed from the people of the world. And I'm going to conclude by giving just one example, because when you talk in the abstract in these principles, it's not as powerful for me anyway, as when you give a particular example. And I'm just going to give one particular example. Oh, a full disclosure, I'm the permanent observer for the International Anti-Corruption Academy. Very, very, very honored to serve under its dean, Ambassador Thomas Stelzer, who was instrumental in getting the negotiations of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Very important treaty. 189 countries have ratified it, and it, in a sense, tracks the commitments of SDG 16 for good governance, transparency, accountability, all of the elements that are necessary to fulfill all of the SDGs. If you don't have good governance, if you have corruption, then the money doesn't get to the people. So it's an essential pillar of the SDGs. It's also a place where money can be found. And the International Anti-Corruption Academy has we have several thousand alumni in over 160 countries. We give master's degrees in the skills needed and capacity building needed to address corruption in the developing world and the developed world. So let me just give an example of a kind of corruption that is so apparent, but we don't normally think of the scale of it. It's the old Odebrecht corruption scandal, emerged from the car wash operation, it was called, which revealed that Odebrecht, a Brazilian multinational construction company, was part of a cartel that bypassed public bidding in Petrobras tenders in exchange for payment of bribes to politicians. Investigation progressed, and it was discovered that they had a very complex corruption scheme replicated in 13 countries, where the executives were paying bribes to government officials in return for contracts and favorable treatment. The company created an actual bureaucracy to identify projects and politicians that could be corrupted to the advantage of this company. Politicians would then call Odebrecht officials requesting illegal funding for election campaigns, interested in gaining undue advantage in construction tenders, or garnering political support for favorable policies in their legislative bodies. Odebrecht would then assess the strategic value of assisting that particular politician, and if approved, the request would be passed to the section of operations that dealt with this, which was established specifically to manage the bribes. The department would develop worksheets with politicians' aliases and passwords for money distribution, which would always be in cash. The money launderers would receive the money in offshore business tax havens and proceed to the distribution, which was accomplished in a variety of methods, including the use of straw men and shell firms. Payments could be routed by as many as 4 offshore bank accounts before reaching a corrupt politician or political party. Odebrecht even purchased an Antiguan branch of an Austrian bank to reduce the risk of suspicion. In the Petrobras scheme in Brazil, political parties nominated Petrobras board members who then approved overpriced contracts offered by the central cartel. The bribes equaled between 1% and 5% of the contracts and were sent to money launderers. It turned out that some of these transactions took place in the United States, and thus the United States Department of Justice had sufficient jurisdiction to prosecute. And the Department of Justice of the United States conducted an investigation. And the head of the company ended up pleading guilty under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, having given millions of bribes for the benefit of government officials in 12 countries: Angola, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, Mozambique, Panama, Peru, and Venezuela, over a period of more than a decade and a half. A U.S. District Court judge ordered the company to pay $2.6 billion in fines. $2.6 billion, this is real money, with around $93 million going in the United States where some of these corrupt practices took place, $116 million to Switzerland, and $2.39 billion to Brazil. It's astonishing how many officers of this company, 78 executives and former executives of the company, signed plea bargaining agreements so that they could go up the ladder. So this is a big multinational company. For that level of corruption to take place in that many countries, it evidences a dire need to strengthen the international commitment to fulfill the vision and the agreements contained in the UN Convention Against Corruption and SDG 16 for good governance. So I'm representing an institute that helps teach prosecutors, judges, relevant officials, and executives in companies how to address corruption. But we need to create a culture of anti-corruption amongst the people that are in this call, in which at a local level, at a city level, corruption is understood to be as insidious as it actually is. And the dire need to advance greater levels of cooperation amongst law enforcement agencies, banking establishments, stock exchanges, etc., to capture this huge amount of money that could be used for better purposes. That's just one avenue of the change that's needed, one avenue that we can obtain, and one avenue that we must obtain. So those are my thoughts, and I know I stretched out very broadly, but I gave a very particular example of what we're talking about at the level that we're talking about, and we know how to deal with it. And here we have an instance in which it got brought into the legal system, into the rule of law, and captured a bunch of culprits who are paying the price. So we know how to deal with it. We need the political will. We need the support for institutions like the International Anti-Corruption Academy. And we need a focus of the large community that understands the value of the SDGs on SDG 16, upon which, as far as I'm concerned, they all depend.
Well, thank you very, very much, Mr. Granoff. That was very interesting and illuminating. And we will now move on to Susie Halleck, who's going to be moderating the questions. Over to you, Susie.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Durbach, for inviting me to, this is, from what I understand from Miriam, this is a really broad, interesting audience of students and practitioners and diplomats and people in business, a much more sophisticated audience than usually gets together around anything. And so it's really an honor to share if to talk about Westphalia in a normal audience, it's just, no one knows what you're talking about. But with this audience, understanding that governments are created to serve human needs, and thus we can change them. And the way it is doesn't have to be the way it is. We can make it better. We have agency.
Thank you, Mr. Granoff. Let's move on to questions. Susie?
Thank you, Dr. Durbeck, and thank you, Mr. Granoff, for the insights and spending time with us here today. Our first question is about a topic that you brought up, about how you've devoted yourself to the abolition of nuclear weapons.
I have a friend who was very instrumental in keeping the Indian Point plant safe, a physicist. And one of the things he explained to me was that there's an art to keeping a nuclear energy plant safe, that it's not just mechanical, that it's a lot more nuanced than can be put in just a manual. You have to actually know the plant and know the peculiarities of it. That the rough and tumble, chaotic process of democracy, the fact that at any time in any democracy, a complete bozo can become the leader of state, a completely incompetent, psychologically immature, or even pathological person could be elected, even in a democracy. And in authoritarian states, the likelihood of the kind of people who want to have authority over everybody are likely to come into power. The dangers of having nuclear energy plants in such circumstances is very high. Now, having said that, there are a lot of people whom I respect very much who are committed to advancing small nuclear energy plants as a bridge to a world without fossil fuel. I'm not convinced, but I'm still open to the possibility. As Albert Einstein said, we know how World War III will be fought, World War IV will be fought. It will be fought with sticks and stones. He also said that the splitting of the atom changed everything except our mode of thinking, and we drift toward catastrophe. I'm a fellow in the World Academy of Arts and Science, which was founded by Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell over this issue. And they saw that the National Academies of Science were inadequate to deal with what science and technology are giving us as the ability to impact our world, and thus the arts of law, the arts of insight, the arts of philosophy, and the arts of ethics need to be brought to the table. But presently, if you watch the media in talking about nukes, what you see, you do not see international lawyers or experts such as myself. What you see is generals. What you see is nuclear weapons defined as a national security value. Whereas we've had many secretaries of defense, such as William Perry, Robert McNamara, committed to moving toward a nuclear weapons-free world. And in fact, Ronald Reagan, often considered conservative, was very committed and put into motion a process that took us down from over 65,000 nuclear weapons to less than 14,000 today. That's not an insignificant achievement. So we know how to do it, but the political will is not there, and the knowledge of what a nuclear weapon does is not sufficiently articulated and spread to the public. Just in exactly the same way as the knowledge of the environment, of what we're doing to the oceans, is not known to the public, nor the routes to getting the money to solve these problems. I would say one of our biggest problems, I call it the pornography of the trivial, in which the media emphasizes the irrelevant and diminishes the relevant.
Thank you. Do you think that Putin will dare to use these weapons in the war in Ukraine? And if so, why and how can other countries help prevent Russia's use of nuclear weapons? Do you think the world community, including international organizations such as the UN, is making enough effort to prevent nuclear terrorism from Russia?
I don't think that, I think Putin is not crazy. I think he's engaged in a war of aggression that's not just a war of aggression, it's a war of imperial conquest to actually deny the moral agency and rights of any kind of the people of the Ukraine to be an independent nation. But I don't think that he's insane, and the people around him, the use of a nuclear weapon poses an enormous escalatory problem even for Russia, and they would be. I don't see any. I doubt highly the likelihood of Russia using them intentionally. Having said that, the risk remains unacceptably high, basically because of computer era and human era. Let me give some examples. In 1995, a weather satellite was sent off the coast of Norway toward the North Pole, and the Russian, this is after the Cold War, and the Russian leadership was told about it, but it didn't get passed up the command and control. So Boris Yeltsin was told he had 8 minutes to decide whether to use his nuclear arsenal or lose control, because it looked like this was a missile headed for Moscow, and it would be a high-level electromagnetic pulse from an explosion that would literally fry the command and control capacity of Russia. He said he knew Bill Clinton, and he didn't see any reason why this would be a nuclear attack. He didn't really have enough time to validate it scientifically. 1983, Stanislav Petrov, a colonel, was watching all of the monitors of the then Soviet Union, and it appeared to be a full-scale United States attack. And I had the privilege of interviewing him, and he said that he didn't pass the information up the command and control because 11,000 nuclear warheads would have rained on the United States and basically destroyed the ecosystem of the planet as well. And he said, I didn't do it because I knew computers made mistakes, because I was a computer engineer. He also said that God told him he didn't want the world to end. And then he said that his superiors didn't know whether to reward him for saving the world or punish him for violating his protocols. And he said what really angered them was that he believed in God. William Perry, Secretary of Defense of the United States, recounted to me a story of a computer chip that we had put in one of our satellites that made a mistake when the sunrise came up. There are my goodness, a 20 megaton bomb fell in North Carolina, and 6 out of 7 of the safety devices failed. It didn't go critical. Missiles blown up in silos. I mean, there's a wonderful book by Eric Schlosser about the numerous mistakes, not to mention straight up human error. So, we can't make a system more perfect than we are. And human beings are imperfect, and nuclear weapons don't leave room for mistakes. So we've got to get rid of them. Now, one of the steps that's needed right now is for the United States and the other nuclear weapon states to, one, give negative security assurances explicitly and legally to all the nations that have renounced the weapons to lower the political currency. 2, take the weapons and pledge never to use them first. And 3, don't degrade the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The reason that treaty has gone into force is because of the frustration of countries seeing that the nuclear weapon states have not lived up to the promises they've already made. So more importantly than anything right now is to get to the negotiating table and treat these existential threats as something that must remain in the realm of diplomacy, not in the realm of military threat. That means living up to promises that have already been made. Test ban treaty, fissile material cutoff treaty, strengthening international safeguards, and lowering the political currency of these devices, and moving toward fulfilling the vision of a nuclear weapons-free world. This is a legal commitment that we have in the NPT and a unanimous decision of the International Court of Justice.
Thank you. In your opinion, what is the main problem of all of humanity right now?
We have to love people and use things. Idolatry is essentially worshiping the things that we create as if we are the creators. So we end up loving things and using people. People are sacred and cannot be reduced to data. People have a sacred dimension to them. And human beings depend on being in harmony with and integrated with the web of life. So to love people means to love the web of life. And the web of life is a gift. We forget that gift every day, in which we become fascinated with the capacities of the things that we create. Ideas are things we create, nations and technology. And we're using these tools at our disposal in a way that isn't respecting the web of life and the sacredness of people. Artificial intelligence is extremely dangerous because it tries to reduce human beings to data. But we're far more than that. And we lose focus on the purpose. We've lost purpose, and we have to ask why. We have art without beauty, philosophy without truth, medicine without healing, law without justice, weapons without security. Weapons, the more we perfect, the less security we get. Religion without love and transcendence, medicine without healing, financial systems disconnected from goods and services. We become so fascinated with our techniques at doing things that we forget the why of philosophy pursuing truth, the why of art to uplift and bring beauty to the world, the why of medicine to heal in all of its dimensions, the why of our economic system to provide goods and services, the why of religion to promote love and transcendence, the why. So we have to come back to core purposes, to core purpose of obtaining that we're here to become human, to love one another and discover our humanity. That is, I think, the problem of modernity. We're not focused on the why of our humanity. As Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell said in their fabulous manifesto, remember your humanity, forget the rest. Put our humanity first. And within that, people who believe that God is the graceful power that gives us our humanity, or just that it exists. Love people, use things. Never love things and use people.
You raised the sense of a neighborhood and a community during your presentation. How can we foster this feeling when generations are becoming more and more independent and remote?
Well, I don't agree with generations becoming more independent and remote. I mean, my goodness, this, in order to get the nation state system, say in the 13th century, the people in Lyon spoke a very different language than the people in Normandy. But something happened between that time and 1650, which was the printing press, which helped create a national grammar of French. So you could have an identity based on a language. Same thing in Italy and Germany and all of the nations of the world. The idea of having an identity is largely dependent upon that technological innovation of the printing press. And today, in a sense, we have a global grammar with this. People all over the world are able to talk to each other like we're doing on this webinar. So the possibility of transcending identities of religion, race, gender, and nation, and affirming as a basis our core humanity is technically possible. And I believe, from my experience in lecturing in many countries, from Russia, China, Mexico, Canada, all over Europe, there's a class of people in your, Susie, in your age group who are global in their perspective and cosmopolitan I mean, I lectured to the elite youth of Russia, and you could take those kids and drop them in Berkeley, California, and they wouldn't miss a beat. I saw kids in China, you could take them to London or Paris or Delhi, and they wouldn't miss a beat either. I mean, the problem is the provincialism that's generated by fear and fear of the other. Fear of the other is a very serious problem. So we almost have we have a divide of information, and the disinformation and use of social media to amplify conflict as a political tool is extremely dangerous. But we have the capacity now to transcend. But I'm not arguing that we should do away with nations, no more than we should do away with local governance of cities. But we create nations to express our values and solve problems. We create city governance. We create county governance. We create state governance. We need to address global threats with global cooperation. That is a reality before us, and the Sustainable Development Goals are that. And addressing corruption, the bad guys. From the reason I cited that case was you could see how many nations this one corporation in Brazil was corrupting. That's just one example. The actors who operate outside of any sense of morality or legal boundaries are operating globally, just like pandemics operate globally. We have a practical necessity to do this. There's no other way to protect the climate. There's no other way to address corruption. There has to be greater cooperation amongst the banking systems. Because, for example, NASDAQ has developed a technology using artificial intelligence that can identify very accurately illicit financial transactions. And it's now being marketed to over 100 stock exchanges to increase the stability of the markets. Banks need to use this, and they need to share this information with law enforcement, and law enforcement needs to follow through. That's one of the problems right now. We don't have an international system of cooperation to stop illicit financial flow. We need the commitment of our political institutions to get there, and we need the people to demand that commitment. But we know the technical capacity is there, and I think within the intelligentsia of the world, we never ever expected to see a pope with 1 billion people in Laudato Si, in his encyclical, talking about addressing the human community as part of his commitment. And then the second part of it, talking as a Catholic. But here is the Pope. The Pope, you see the same thing in the Buddhist leadership with the Dalai Lama. You see the same thing in many of the world's religious leaders, but at a local level, we're still seeing prejudice, and we're still seeing the dangers of religiously motivated provincial distortions and violence. So, we're in a debate on this issue, but the capacity for the change for the better, I think, is right before us.
What are the most effective ways to convey to people the importance of preserving health and the environment? Coronavirus and climate change have both been politicized. So how do we get humanity as a whole to band together? And furthermore, will leaders and nations be prepared when the next human health disaster arises?
Well, the first thing is the empirical, for people who want to engage in good faith discussion, empirical facts matter. So I wrote an article in Newsweek at the beginning of COVID about how this should not be seen as a national security issue, that this is a global security issue and a human security issue. But before I did it, I called up the son of Jonas Salk, of the Salk vaccine, which was so effective in eliminating polio, to find out what was the secret sauce that led to the eradication of polio. And I also talked to him about smallpox. He's a professor at UCLA. And he said, go watch the interview of my father, Jonas Salk, with Edward R. Murrow, in which Edward R. Murrow asks him, who owns the patent on this? And Jonas Salk said, you don't patent the sun. The patent's owned by the people. That spirit guided both the Soviet Union and the United States to have scientists cooperate in addressing polio, while publicly they were condemning one another as evil, but they had enough maturity to encourage the scientific community to deal with it in a realistic fashion, and it did. And then civil society organizations like the Rotary International addressed smallpox in a global cooperative way. So we know we can do that. It is very dangerous to be defining pandemics at a national level. So that's number one. Number two, I have found this very effective, and I've done this actually in Russia and China, and at the Parliament of the World Religions, people from all the religious organizations of the world. I reminded them of the fact that at least 60% of our oxygen comes from phytoplankton. And the phytoplankton depends on the health of the oceans, the pH of the oceans. And thus, at least every other breath is given to us by this single cell organism in the oceans. And if you stop for a moment, just stop for a moment and think of the reality, not imagination, the reality of how we are being breathed. If you think of the trees as upside down lungs, we depend on the trees. They depend on us. We depend on the oceans. We depend on that. That is part of our body. It's not an externality. It is our third lung. If Susie, if you lost a lung or if I lost a lung, we could live. Not well, but we could live. But if we lose that third lung, we all die. So we have a need to protect this common lung that we all depend upon. So, and what is causing it to be put at risk is our own Anthropocene arrogance, our own attitude toward the natural world. So not only do we have to come together to address financial flows, which we create, and bring health to the financial systems of the world and uproot corruption, we have to bring some reality to our thinking about how we live as human beings and the fact that we are not separate from the web of life, that we depend on the health of the oceans. And right now, it depends on us.
In your opinion, how does corruption affect the processes of state development? And how can we work to reduce corruption in the legal system and societies, such as the countries you mentioned during your presentation?
Well, it corruption, bribery, distortions of political process, not only steal enormous amounts of money that could be used for public services, but they privilege characters who simply don't care about the well-being of their populations. So corruption is like a cancer. It affects the whole body. It metastasizes. It steals resources, and it corrupts the ability of commerce to take place in a healthy fashion. It privileges evil. It privileges people who don't care, and it diminishes people who are working for the public good. We need to train more people in the skills needed. But most importantly is when in governments in which democracy and the rule of law are strong, say the Scandinavian governments, in which people feel that their government is their government, it represents their values, that their votes mean something, that the system of law is honored. Nobody washes a rental car. If you don't feel that your government is your government, but it's something imposed from above, corruption will be rampant. When democracy and the rule of law are foundations, and there's transparency and accountability, corruption is dramatically diminished. So we have to strengthen the rule of law, strengthen accountability, strengthen democracy, strengthen journalists and the freedom of journalists in order to report truth, and truth matters. And those who violate these principles need to be held to account.
What would you recommend reading for general development and specifically for knowledge of ethical and legal norms?
That, knowledge of legal and ethical norms is largely a matter of the spirit in most societies. And so I think that if whatever society you're in, you will find some iteration of the golden rule. And that you will find it in, the Prophet Muhammad said, no one of you will enter into heaven only once for others, once for himself. Jesus said, Jesus articulated the golden rule, what you want for yourself, you must want for others. Then there's some iterations, what you find distasteful, do not do unto others. But there is some iteration of the golden rule. And I think that rule not only brings stability in yourself and in your family and in your community, but it needs to be applied amongst nations. So I would say find any literature that ultimately rests upon advocating the golden rule and dig deep into it, but most importantly, dig deep into yourself and see whether it matters to you. Whether it matters to you what kind of character you have, whether it matters to you whether you've developed skills that are of benefit to others, whether you find fulfillment in service toward others or find fulfillment in just trying to meet your own desires and wants. I would propose that the greatest pleasures that we have as human beings is in sharing with others, and that's existentially necessary for society to have enough people who understand the value of public service. So I would think it would be very arrogant for me to say that there's one text, Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, the Quran, the analytics of Confucius. It doesn't matter. What matters is reading yourself and being very honest with your own values and how you are committed to bringing them into practice. The literature of the wise is easy to find, but taking time out with oneself to develop skills that are of value to others and then bringing them into practice, that's not so easy, but it's very valuable. And it can be done doing anything, being a street sweeper, being a carpenter, being a lawyer, being a nurse, being a teacher. Anyone can find ways of bringing these qualities into action. I am a lawyer, so obviously I'm looking at legal institutions. But that's not the only way in which virtue can be brought into life. And when virtue is brought into life, the consequence is peace.
In your opinion, how does the profession of a journalist intersect with the profession of a lawyer?
Well, first, lawyers are needed to protect journalists. And journalists need protection because journalists reveal corruption, journalists reveal wrongdoing, and journalists thus put themselves at risk. Journalists are courageous. Journalists are at risk because the market is become so dominant in the field of journalism, and thus we just saw in the case of a very popular media in the United States, Fox News. We just saw that its so-called news journalists were actually lying to the public, knowingly lying to the public because they wanted to have more market share. And we've just seen how many of the newspapers in the United States have closed their international bureaus because that doesn't sell papers. So journalists need protection, and we need to encourage greater value for this profession, especially investigative journalists. Journalists need lawyers to protect them, and lawyers, if the rule of law is to be meaningful, you have to live in a society in which people are accurately informed, and in which freedom of speech and debate and dissent are seen as values. That dissent does not mean disunity. It means being able to. Here's an example. I recently heard some very good presentations. A very good presentation by Jeffrey Sachs about how expansion of NATO, military bases of the United States, the missile defense deployments in Poland and Romania, et cetera, have put Russia into a very frightened position, leading to its behavior. But then there was a rebuttal that it was in Romania, and a professor got up and said, you can say this as an American citizen and not be afraid, but if somebody were to criticize Russia's conduct in Russia, they run the risk of being thrown out of a 14th story or being poisoned. And I would say that all governments need correction. All governments need journalists to point out their problems. All governments will overreach, and they need to be corrected. And only in a society in which there's freedom of speech can the correction be made. The United States made a terrible mistake in invading Iraq, but we can debate and make corrections. We have the possibility of doing that. But in countries in which there's an authoritarian rule and no freedom of journalism and speech, you can't make the corrections. We are mistake-making machines as human beings. We need to have open debate in order to improve ourselves and correct ourselves. That is key to, and we need to be able to do that to ourselves. We need to look at ourselves and correct ourselves. And we need to be able to correct, we need to be brutally honest, and we need to be able to correct our governments.
Thank you so much, Mr. Granoff. And we've just wrapped our Q&A, so I'll turn back to Dr. Durbach to close out.
Thank you, Susie.
Thank you very much, Susie, and thank you, Mr. Granoff. You made very, very important and relevant statements. I just wanted to mention that, in my opinion, our biggest problem started when Citizens United was passed by the Supreme Court. Clarence Thomas, I'm sure you're reading about him now, is the one that basically pushed it through, and nobody really knew about his corruption while a Supreme Court justice. But that has enabled the corporations to basically spend millions of dollars putting money into the pockets of people that they wanted elected. And without, as you say, the rule of law, which doesn't always function, it is very, very difficult to have a democratic society run well. Particularly a society as big as ours, which, as you know, is very, very heterogeneous. And it's much more difficult to run than a homogeneous society.
Citizens United, for the audience, is a Supreme Court case in which the court gave all of the privileges and immunities to corporations that would be given to individuals, to human beings.
Correct.
Thus treating a thing that we've created as if it were a person. And the point that I was making is we have to love people and use things. In this instance, the Supreme Court was saying, we love these things as much as people. And thus it's corrupting. I totally agree with you. That was a terrible decision.
And I hope to be able to, how should I put it, modify or be able to disband it at some date when we have an administration that is capable of doing it. So again, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And we wish you a very good week. And Susie, thank you for moderating. Have a good week. Bye-bye.